Hello, friends, brothers, sisters. Welcome all of you to those who are listening and joining us now online. Those of you listening to this at some point in the future, welcome once again to our online teaching series. My name's Josh Lalgee. I go to Restoration House Firswood, part of Church of God of Prophecy under Bishop Ted Roy Powell. Our pastor is Pastor Lloyd Gordon, whom I would like to thank again for the opportunity to share this time with you all, for giving me a platform so that we can sit together and get into the Word of God and understand it better and try to read it better and see how this whole document, this whole series of books we call the Bible, fits together and can impact us in the here and now. Pastor Lloyd has been going through a repositioning series with us, which has been really helpful to me. It's helped me really focus my prayers in the day. They're 15-minute videos that give us a focus for our prayer, that just give us some direction and help us pray in the right way, help us pray into the things that God is speaking to the church about. It's a very exciting time to be in Restoration House Firswood. God is really on the move. He's really speaking. He's really engaging with us in a very meaningful way. And it's a real thrill to be a part of this church at this time. And what Pastor Lloyd is doing for us with these 15-minute devotions is just helping us refocus and reposition ourselves so that we're praying from a place of spiritual authority that we can really take, so that we're praying from a place of strength and not of weakness, that we're praying from a place of faith rather than fear. And so the series has been really helpful. There is a link in the description so that you can access the videos, and I highly recommend that you do. All of the previous videos from previous days are available there, so you can binge the lot of them if you want to, or you can just go through one at a time, day by day, and take on what's going on. And it will give you a real sense of what God is speaking to us about as a church, the direction in which He's leading us to pray in this time of pivot, of transition, of change within the church. So thanks again, Pastor Lloyd, for the guidance there. You'll be seeing other members of the pastoral team popping up on there every now and again as we continue the series going forward. But I highly recommend that you get involved in those to get a sense of the consistent message that God is bringing. And consistency is a real important theme with God. See, God is not a man that He should lie, nor the Son of Man that He should change His mind. And there is tremendous consistency in what God is saying to us as a body in the here and now, and there is also tremendous consistency to His Word, to the Bible. And that's one of the big things that I want us to get from this teaching series. It's the consistency that exists from Genesis to Revelation and everything in between. The whole thing is linked. The whole thing tells one complete story. And it's really important that we get a hold of that. A lot of times, a lot of people get worked up about the Bible and inconsistencies, and, the God of the Old Testament is different to the God of the New Testament, and it's just not true. We have the same God. And I hope that as we go through the scriptures and we look at them in this way, and we take our time going through and really pick out the themes and the important ideas that were present in the mind of the writer and the original readers, as well as us in the here and now, that we will get a real sense of that consistency. And so it's consistency that has sort of led us to this point in the teaching series. Originally, we were going to just be looking at specific foreshadows of the cross, of the atonement of Jesus, within the first 5 books of the Old Testament in very specific areas. Now, that is something that we intend to continue. But what became really apparent as we were looking through and studying these particular narratives within the first 5 books of the Old Testament is that there is such importance in understanding the people involved in the story, the characters of those involved. So, following from what Pastor Lloyd spoke about a little bit before Easter, we looked straight at the Passover and the blood over the doors and the power of that blood. And it became really clear that we needed to understand who Moses was before the Passover situation came, before he truly encountered God, the account that we're given of his life up to the burning bush, and the difference between who he was then and who he was when he led the people across the Red Sea. You see, Moses went on a journey, and it's really important when we look at these heroes of the faith in the Old Testament. We often just think that everything they did was right because we know their end point in the story, because we know where they end up. It's very easy for us to lose their sense of humanity, to lose the sense of their journey and how they went from being fairly regular guys in some respects to being spectacularly used by God. Because God doesn't pick us because we're special. He picks us because we yield to him, because we allow his Holy Spirit to come into us and interact with God through us. And it's really important to recognize that this was true back in ancient times, thousands of years before Jesus. And it's still true today. So we don't get hung up on things like hero worship and getting all worked up because we're not at the point of, parting the Red Sea, being prepared to sacrifice anything and everything for God. We can look at these men. We can look at their lives and the journey that God took them on, the grace and the mercy that he showed them, and the time that he allowed them, how he forgave them their shortcomings and still delivered on his promises. So having looked at Moses and his life and how he went from being a criminal on the run from Egypt and the Pharaoh to being the one who stood up in front of Pharaoh in the power of God, saying, "Let my people go," and spectacular things followed. And last time I should say, we looked at Abraham and his sacrifice, or near sacrifice, of Isaac, which was then interrupted, and they were given a lamb whose head was caught in thorns as a sacrifice, which gave us a very clear picture of Jesus. And we learn from that about the provision of God, his ability and his willingness to provide a sacrifice so that we need not die. When we looked at this, one of the important verses that came out was when God said to Abraham, "Now I know your heart." And what we said at the time was that at this point, God was so close and intimate with the heart of Abraham because of everything that Abraham had been through, because of the journey of faith that Abraham had been on, all of the events that had led up to that moment. He had drawn closer and closer to God through both success and through failure. And so we're going to spend some time having a look at that life, having a look at those successes and those failures. We're going to look at this complete identity change. Everything, even down to his name, was different by the time he was ready to sacrifice Isaac, from the moment that God spoke to him and he responded. So we're going to take a look at that journey. I'm not sure how long this is going to take us, but because of the resources that we have available to us, we are able to take a slow walk through this. We're able to look carefully, and we're able to let the Holy Spirit speak to us even as we go into a time of teaching. So I want to start today looking in Genesis 12. So this is when Abram is called for the first time by God. Now, as a little bit of backdrop, we're told in Joshua 24 and verse 2 that Abraham, his name changes in, I think, chapter 15, and we will come to that. Probably not today, but we will come to that. And thereafter, he was referred to as Abraham. So when Joshua is making reference to Abraham, he's talking about Abram, as he was known at this point. But what he says is that Abraham lived, excuse me, beyond the river and worshipped other gods. Abram was he was well versed in building altars to and worshipping other gods. This was a very common practice in that time, in that place. Everybody was worshipping some kind of god. What's really significant is that the very early parts of Genesis hold God, our God, out to be the one true God, creator of all things. And that's a really significant point to be made, because everybody was worshipping. Everybody was worshipping somebody. And a lot of the wars that happened were basically, if my God is stronger than your God, we'll win. And if your God is stronger than my God, we'll win. But there was far more to this God than just military might and making people's lives easier. And so the God that is the creator of heaven and earth, that is described in the early parts of Genesis, is the one who calls on this man, Abram, who is quite happily going along his life worshipping other gods. Now, one of the things a lot of people get hung up on is Abram and his wife, Sarai, as she's known then. She then later becomes known as Sarah. We get hung up on their age a lot, okay? It's worth noting that people were living a lot longer back then than they are now. We're told that he was 75 when he was called. Now, in modern times, we're looking at a very old man, not very old, but old, certainly looking at retirement, trying to settle down. He does go on to live another 100 years, it is worth noting. His father lived 205 years. It was not uncommon for people to be living a really, really long time. So try not to get too hung up on the age of people, especially when we start to look at the birth of Isaac, because the miracle was not necessarily that Sarah was so old, but that she was barren. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We will get to that. So we're told that Abram, as he was known then, he lived in land beyond the sea, beyond the river, and worshipped other gods. So that's sort of the backdrop to his life. That's we're told that in Joshua 24 and verse 2. So if we jump into Genesis 12, it says this: the Lord had said to Abram, go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So this is the initial engagement that God has with this man, Abram. Abram, who is at this point a worshipper of foreign gods, probably gods of the moon, that he would have built altars to and prayed for. It was very common where they were originally living in Ur, and then they moved up to Haran. If you look back a little bit, at the end of verse 11, it describes Moses. it describes Abraham's father and how he took his family from Ur they were aiming for Canaan. Now, that was a really long way, and they had to go around the desert. So they basically had to go northwest to then go southwest. And by the time they'd gotten all the way northwest to Haran, they decided they were going to settle there. That was good enough for them. So there was a sense of journeying with this family anyway. And their original destination was supposed to be Canaan, but they stopped in Haran. So when the Lord called Abram and he said, go to the land I will show you, Abram was already essentially halfway through a journey. They'd just settled where they decided to settle because it was nice. It's better than Ur. Saved them having to walk like hundreds and hundreds of miles to relatively unknown territory as they were heading to the west. But this is the land that God had called, that God had promised for Abram. He didn't know it yet. So he was essentially, because we wonder, how did he know where to go? He just continued on the journey that he was on. And then God started to show you things, and he promised him, I'll make you into a great nation. I will bless you. Now, bear in mind, this is a guy who is 75 and married to a barren lady. Seems an odd choice for God, but therein we get such an image of the kind of people that God chooses. He chooses the ones that the world would say, you've got no chance. This was true in Abraham's time. And we miss this. When we talk about Abraham, we know he's this great hero of the faith. We know him as the man described in Hebrews 11, and all these wonderful things said about him. This great patriarch, he's the first man mentioned. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm going to come on to why that is later on as well. But we get this sort of mythical idea of him. And we sometimes forget that he was just a guy following his dad around with his barren wife. That's it. He was nobody. He was just a guy. Less than that, he was a guy who had zero chance of being made a great nation. Almost a bit of a pitiful character, if you really want to, put a fine point on it. But he's the one that God chose. He's the one through whom God knew that he would make manifest his greatness. And the thing that Abraham would go on to really take hold of was the importance of God's glory and the wonder of him. And God knew that he would be, and he was able to show himself great through Abram, who would go on to be Abraham. At this point, he's Abram. So in verse 4, it goes on to say, let's just jump back a moment. Verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. This is a very important part of the promise as we move into this first event that really takes place. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. That part of the promise is far more vast than Abram could have realized even at the time. And God will go on to express the magnitude and the breadth to which his promise will reach as he goes forward in his life. God didn't give Abram the whole picture. Nothing that he said was untrue. Everything that God said in that first opening speech to Abram was absolutely true. But there was more to come. And that's another thing. We know this because we have the benefit of hindsight. We know the rest of the story. But it's important to remember that when God gives you a promise, there may well be a great deal more to it than we think. And one of the great things about Abram is that he allows God to continue to minister to him that he doesn't let his shortcomings or his own ideas of his own limitations get in the way. And even when he does, God proves himself greater. And Abram takes those lessons and really gets a hold. And what we're going to see developing is how this understanding of and this intimacy with God grows and grows. So verse 4, Genesis 12 and verse 4 says, So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Lot was Abram's nephew. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarai and his nephew Lot, and all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan and arrived there. Abram travelled through the land as far as the site of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, To your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. I was going to pause there. So we've got this sense that there's been a lot of travel involved. Abram's gone with his nephew, who was pretty much going to be his heir if he was to have one. He was the closest thing he could have to an heir because obviously his wife was barren. Now, so Abram is going through, and again we keep seeing the Lord appearing to Abram, and this is a wonderful thing that is happening to him, and he recognizes that this is the one true God. Abram is, we know that he worshipped other gods. He was a worshipper, and God appeared to him because even then God was seeking those who are worshippers, those who would seek him. Abraham didn't know he was seeking the one true God, but he was a worshipper, and God continually appeared to this worshipper because he continued to seek him and do as he was told. Now, it does say in verse 6, at that time the Canaanites were in the land. The Canaanites are going to play a huge part in the whole promised land narrative as the whole Bible draws on. But it's worth noting that this was not an empty land that God had prepared. There was work to be done. There was potential opposition already, even for Abram and his family. So God didn't say, go into this land and it will be just there ready and waiting for you. There was going to have to be a contest, and that became very apparent. Verse 8, From there he went on towards the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram set out and continued towards the Negev. So we've got this land that has been promised to Abram and his descendants. God has said this is going to be yours. What's really interesting is that verse 10 doesn't say, and the Canaanites fled the land, and the land was lush and plentiful. And Abram established himself there in a palace, and his family lived there forever and ever. No, the very next thing that is written is, now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. Let's just pause for a moment and take a look at the situation Abram now finds himself in. He's left his father's house. He's left the land that he'd been in. He'd taken his stuff with him, but all of the security and the whole legacy that goes along with being in his father's land, his father's house, has now been taken away. He's gone to a land that is already occupied, that is already inhabited, that if he is going to take, is going to require a battle, a contest of some kind. He is not just going to be able to walk in and have it. Not only that, but this same land has now gone into a great famine and forced him to go to Egypt because the famine is so great. At this point, if it were me, I'd be thinking, I may have got this wrong. And so now we start to get the first sense of Abram's faith wavering and failing a little bit. Because he's looking at his situation and thinking, have I really... I mean, nations after me? I don't even have my own son. I'm in this land that's supposed to be promised to me. There are enemies there. And there's a famine there. I mean, what is this all about? So he goes to Egypt to live there for a while. As he was about to enter Egypt, this is verse 11, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. I'm going to hit pause there again. I would again like to sort of just disabuse you of the whole age issue. All right? Again, people were living a lot longer. I'm not saying I know the answer to this, but realistically, if people are going to be living 175, 200 years, when they're in their 60s and 70s, they're probably going to be looking pretty good. So it's not inconceivable that this woman of about 65 will be considered beautiful. And she was. But again, I think it's a life expectancy thing. I think that because people were living longer, generally they weren't aging as quickly. And so when they were that age, they were not as old as we might necessarily perceive someone in our society. I mean, let's be clear. We're talking about a woman who is so beautiful, they are willing to kill the husband so that the king can have her for himself. All right? That's pretty good beauty. That's top level beauty. Okay? So, again, it's just worth bearing in mind that we're not dealing with 2022 levels and timescales for aging. Okay? Because again, Abraham would live to 175. His father lived to 205. This was, that people were living longer back then. And so it's not inconceivable that they were aging a little slower. Verse 12. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but will let you live. So say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. What we see here is Abram scheming. He's plotting. He's looked at his situation and he's thought, this is not working out. I am going to have to find a way to make this work. At this point, he's forgotten what God has promised him. Or if he's not forgotten, he certainly doesn't believe it with his whole heart. This is very far removed from the character that we were looking at last time, who was willing and ready to sacrifice his son at the word of this God. So he starts to scheme, and this is something that maybe we can relate to. God said this thing to me, and I have to now scheme a little bit. Or it's okay if I do something a little deceitful or something that's a little bit wrong, if it is a means to the end of having God's promise fulfilled. Listen to me. God has a way of fulfilling his will and his purpose without your scheming. Okay? But God does make good on his promise through this entire situation, as we will see. Verse 15, when Pharaoh's officials saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and she was taken into his palace. He treated Abram well for her sake, And Abram acquired sheep, cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But, verse 17, the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh summoned Abram. "What have you done to me?" he said. "Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister, so that I look to her to be my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go." Then Pharaoh gave orders about Abram to his men, and they sent him on his way with his wife and everything he had. There are a lot of parallels here between what happened in Abram's life to what would go on to happen to the entire nation before Moses has them set free. And we get a sense of the reason for the writing of this book from this little passage here. See, it's worth remembering that the reason that we laboured on the life of Moses and his values and his passions is because he's the writer of these first 5 books of the Bible. He wrote this book of Genesis. He wrote down the stories that he had heard about Abraham. And he wrote them with a purpose, yes, under the inspiration of God. But he wrote them to be a guide and cautionary to his people as they were looking to leave Egypt and cross the desert and go into the same promised land that had been promised to them. You see, the first thing that is written in the account is about how the land was promised to Abraham and his descendants. And the people, the Hebrews coming out of Egypt, knew that they were Abraham's descendants. And so this was to tell them that God was going to take them to their promise. And everything about this early section in the life of Abram tells us that God makes good on his promise. Because God brought plague and disease. Again, it's exactly what he would go on to do with Moses. They entered Egypt because of a famine in exactly the same way at the end of the story of the life of Joseph. The people of God went there, and then they settled there for far too long. But God brought plagues. He brought a curse to them, and they were released. And they went away rich. We see here that Abram left Egypt wealthy. In just the same way, the people of God in Exodus would leave Egypt wealthy. They had a lot of gold, they had a lot of silver, so on and so forth from their neighbours, from the people of Egypt. Of course, this will go on to be used to build the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, with tremendous precision, by the way. But the parallels are there, and it's well worth noting that Moses was writing this to say, look, God has done this before. He has delivered his chosen people from Egypt, from Pharaoh, before, using plagues. He's done this before. And there are some really clear parallels that are there to be drawn. So, what Abram has done is scheme. He's lied, he's deceived, and he's tricked his way. But God has still made good on his promise to him. Abram has considered his own neck and nothing else. He was happy enough to give his wife up to being one of the many wives or concubines, or however you want to say it, of the Pharaoh. He was looking out for his own neck. He thought, this isn't working. I've got to protect myself at whatever cost. And we're going to see a contrast. Because God stays true to his promise, something starts to shift in the heart of Abram. Because the next account that we're given is of what happens when he and his nephew Lot separate. What we're seeing is a change in his heart. We're seeing him go from someone who is very human, who is dealing with very human issues like disappointment, just like the people of God would go on to experience wandering the desert. They became disillusioned and disappointed very, very quickly. And Moses has written these stories down to show them, listen, you may feel disappointed, but God has not forgotten about you, and his promises are still good. His promises are still true. He desperately wanted his people to get this, because remember that Moses loved his people. That was one of the first traits that we see that comes through in the accounts of his life. So that he really cares about his people, has a real sense of brotherhood, of kinship with them. And so he wrote this down to show them, look, this is God. It may seem like it's not going to happen. It didn't seem like they could get out of Egypt, but they did. Just because it doesn't look like it's going to work doesn't mean that it can't. And God has a way of doing amazing things. And we're going to see that continually through the life of Abram into Abraham. But this first instance that we're told about, he's given all these promises and it starts to look like these aren't really going to happen. And so the first thing he does is try and save his own skin. But God doesn't abandon him. God curses Pharaoh because he's basically stolen his wife. It wasn't, he was deceived, but still. And so these curses come on him, these plagues come upon him. He recognizes that this has happened since this guy Abram's arrived, and he's thinking, what's going on here? So he sends him on his way, and he sends him with all the things that he's accumulated. As we move into verse 13, it says, so Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had. Lot went with them. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and silver and gold. That was from Egypt. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel. If you remember, Bethel is where he set his tent and built an altar to the Lord. To the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier and where he had first built an altar. There Abram called on the name of the Lord. See, he's gone back to worship. He's gone from a place of fear. He's realized that this God that's speaking to him is real, and he's real in his difficulty as much as he is real in his promise. And when there's all this optimism and anticipation, in the face of disappointment, he has realized now that God is real, and he has begun to worship. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. But the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarrelling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. So, now there are two nations in this land, as well as Abram and his group. I was going to say his lot, but him too. So the land has become more populated with people. So this has only enhanced the problem that Abram was seeing in the first place. But now he's not worrying about it. What is his concern now is the fact that Lot's family and herdsmen and Abram's family and herdsmen are too great for the land to sustain. And there is arguments, there's infighting within the families, and that's not good. This is a great concern to Abram. Verse 8, so Abram said to Lot, let's not have quarrelling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. In the King James it says we're brethren. Is not the whole land before you? This is Abram talking to Lot. Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. And if you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. The two men parted company. I'm going to hit pause there. A couple of weeks ago when I was preaching, this scripture came up. And it's really interesting that when Moses is writing about this, he says it was well watered like the garden of the Lord and the land of Egypt. Now, again, when this was written, the people of God will have known that they came to the land of Egypt as a collective. You know, they were there 400 years in slavery. So a few generations have passed, but they will have known that they came to Egypt because of the famine and stayed because they thought life was going to be easier there. Okay? We know what goes on. I mean, Moses says, right, this is before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. In verse 13, it reminds us that the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. So we're told these things about this land, this lush-looking land that that Lot was allowed to choose. Remember, Abram was his uncle. He was his elder. He would have been well within his rights to choose for himself, but he was so concerned with the unity of his family, with the unity among the brethren, that he allowed his nephew to have first choice as to where they would go when they part company. So Lot looks and he sees that this land is lush. It's by the Jordan. It's right near Sodom. We know what ends up happening to Sodom and Gomorrah. It's then likened to Egypt, the land of Egypt, and also like the garden of the Lord. Now, it's worth looking at what links those three places together. What's consistent among those three places? As well as being lush and plentiful, so there's no fear of famine. So there's no real reason to really lean on God and need him, because everything you need is just like there. And what's consistent in all of those places is that the people, the inhabitants' hearts are corrupted against God, and they make their own deities, they make their own gods, sometimes out of themselves. If you look way back at the beginning of Genesis, what the serpent says to Eve is that if you eat of the fruit, you will be like God. And their hearts were turned. They wanted to be their own God. In Egypt, the pharaohs were considered, at least by themselves, deities. This is something that I spoke about when we talked about the life of Moses. They were false gods. And in Sodom and Gomorrah, well, we all know what was going on there, and it says, just to remind us, that they were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. They had everything they wanted. They were so comfortable. Everything was so easy for them. They thought, you know what? I don't need God. And they had missed the point of the human existence. They'd missed that God is what matters. And they'd become so convinced that success on the earth is everything that counts, that they'd sinned against God. They'd become their own gods, and then God had to step in and deal with them. This is what is being pointed out when Moses writes about the land and the plain of the Jordan near Zoar, well watered like the garden of the Lord and the land of Egypt. When things are too easy, and you bear in mind that Abraham has just had to leave, not long, had to leave Canaan because of a famine. That's where God sent him. And where Lot chose to go was somewhere where he calculated, as not likely to have famine there. I'm good. We'll be fine there. So the calculation that Lot had made was to make himself safe and comfortable. In just the same way that Abraham had previously decided in Egypt, he had to keep himself safe. Abraham learned his lesson, and Lot did not. So he chose the land right next to Sodom and Gomorrah that was going to get destroyed, that was like Egypt, where they had their own false gods, where the king was a god, at least in his own eyes, and the eyes of most of his people. And it led to all sorts of corruption. The things that were going on in Egypt were disgusting. There was so much incest because of this sense of Pharaoh's deific status. What was going on in Sodom and Gomorrah was reprehensible. And in the garden of the Lord, they went from walking with God to turning from him and hiding from him because they became corrupted by their desire to be God themselves. You see what happens when people are left to their own devices, when things are left to be easy for people and they get comfortable and they start to think that they're all that. If you're wondering why God doesn't want you in comfort, it's because he wants your heart more. He wants you to be close to him. And if everything around you is too easy, you've got no reason to call on him. You've no reason to trust him, because you can trust the resources around you, and it will erode your relationship with God. So much of the New Testament is trial and tribulation for the early church. It's shipwrecks, it's imprisonment, it's martyrdom. And yet God is so in that, because there is far greater for us in eternity than there can be in this life. And our choice is very clear. You can choose this life or you can choose eternity. And this is the choice that is set here. Verse 11. So Lot chose himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. The two men parted company. Verse 12. Abraham lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and sinning greatly against the Lord. We move on to verse 14. The Lord said to Abram after Lot had parted from him, look around where you are. Abram had been left in the hills. Winters were harsh and cold. It wasn't like that down on the plains. You know, they got the runoff of all that snow melting and falling down the mountain. The lush grass. But things were hard in Canaan sometimes, certainly in the hills. It wasn't easy to be up there. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had parted from him, look around where you are, to the north and the south, to the east and the west. All the land that you see, I will give you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go, walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you. So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents. There he built an altar to the Lord. Abram had chosen to preserve the unity of the brethren ahead of his desire to succeed in this life. God saw that, and he started to speak, to reveal his person, his promise to Abram. Abram got to know God better. But what we see even up to now is that every time there was an interaction with God, Abram was required to lay something down. It was going to cost him. First thing that God says to Abram back in chapter 12 is to leave the land of your father. He has to give things up. And what we see as we go through the life of Abram, and as we continue to do so in the coming weeks, we're going to see that he has to sacrifice in order to hear God, to get his promises and see those promises fulfilled. But God doesn't leave him hanging. He has to give up his comfort. Up to now, he's given up his comfort of his home to go and live up in the hills. He's given up his comfort and ease. He could have taken the easy way out and gone to the plains near Sodom. But look at what happened. Because he offered up, he gave the chance to preserve his family's relationship, to preserve the unity of the brethren. He gave Lot the opportunity to choose where he wanted to go. And Lot went down to the plains, and he could have everything that he touched. But Abram was left in the hills, and God told him to look out in all directions and promised him everything that he could see. What we see, even at this early stage in the life of Abram, is that as he trusted God, God continued to reveal himself and his truth to him. And this is all part of the repositioning journey. We're looking at this because this is a guy who went through a complete repositioning journey. And this is where we want to go as a church. We're trying to reposition ourselves so that we hear God more clearly and we move in a meaningful and effective way by his calling. But we can see clearly here that this is going to require sacrifice. It is not going to require us to scheme and plot and try and work out how we can make the will of God happen. It is going to require us to build our altars to the Lord. It's going to require us to forego the comforts that we seek after in our flesh. It's going to require us to seek after God and his will. It's going to require us to worship him, to not worship things like money, to not worship things like comfort, to not worship things like ease. It's going to require us to seek after him. And we see that punctuated through Abram's life. He builds an altar and he worships God. This was a man who knew how to worship, and so he worshipped God. And God is looking for us to be worshipful. He's looking us to worship him, to seek after him. And there we will be rewarded because we're seeking him and he's there to be found. And the promises came thick and fast as he continued to lay down his comfort, his ego. He could easily have said to Lot, look, I'm the elder here. I want to go here so you can go there. Our people are fighting and I'm going to put a stop to it because I'm the one in charge. But he didn't, because he cared about the unity of the brethren. So we're starting to get a picture of the things that matter to God and are causing Abram to change into the guy who we spoke about a couple of weeks ago, who was ready to do whatever God called him to. And as we go through the next couple of weeks, we're going to continue to look at how this repositioning happened, what it cost him, what he had to give up, and what he gained. I hope that this has been helpful for you. I hope that you have enjoyed it. I hope it's made you see things in a slightly different way. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the comments section. I'll be looking at them and I'll be glad to have a chat with you about them. If you want to catch up with me, I will be at Restoration House Firswood at UA 92 on Sunday morning. It'd be great to catch up with you there if you can make it. We're really our services are really powerful. We're having great times with God. He's really ministering to us. He's speaking specifically into our situations. Yesterday we had a really powerful service, and God really started to speak into some areas in people's lives, and it was so good to see God ministering as He did. So I'll be there if you want to catch up with me in person. Again, if you want to leave some questions and comments, that would be great. Don't forget the link in the description to the Repositioning series with the 15-minute prayer devotionals. Thank you again for joining me. Thank you for listening to me. Thank you for going through the word with me. I pray that you would have a blessed week. I pray that God would reveal himself to you as you seek after him. I pray that he would make clear his promises to you, and that you would have the strength and the courage to take him at his word and to do things in his way for his glory. Be blessed. Thank you once again, and I'll see you next week.